Allan Lichtman is joining me. He is Distinguished Professor of History at American University. He is also the creator of the 13 Keys system for predicting the results of presidential elections. I think a good place to start, Professor, is when did you create this system and how did you create it?
Well, I created it a long time ago, back in 1981, when I was 9 years old, of course, not exact. And I would love to tell, you, your audience, and I particularly would like to tell students that I came up with the 13 keys to the White House by spending years in musty libraries, thousands of hours of contemplation. But if I were to tell you that, to quote the late Richard Nixon, that would be wrong. I came across the keys totally by accident. I met that year in 1981, I was at Caltech as a visiting scholar, and I met a man named Volodya Kailas-Borak from Moscow, who was a rare member of both the Soviet and U.S. Academy of Sciences and the world's leading expert in earthquake prediction. And I told him I did mathematical history, and he said, let us collaborate. And I said, no, we're not. I've got to go back to Washington, D.C. Nobody cares about earthquakes. And he said, no, I don't want to collaborate on earthquakes. He said, ever since I went to the United States in 1963, as part of the scientific delegation that negotiated the nuclear test ban treaty, I've been in love with politics. But I live in the Soviet Union. Predicting elections, forget it. It's supreme leader or off with your head. But you know about American presidential elections. And that's how this got started. And it may seem a little bit crazy to be combining earthquake prediction with political prediction, but in fact, it makes perfect sense because we rethought elections not as Republicans versus Democrats, liberals versus conservatives, or Jimmy Carter versus Ronald Reagan, this was 1981, but in geophysical terms, as stability, the party holding the White House stays in office, or earthquake, the party holding the White House is tossed out of office. And we had a theory. The theory was that basically you have stability or upheaval based upon the strength and performance of the party holding the White House. The big picture, the economy, foreign policy, social unrest, scandal. And the challenging party and the campaign don't matter. So we looked at every presidential election from 1860 to 1980, and we came up with the 13 keys, the 13 key factors. True-false questions that could be answered in advance of an election and that both gave you insight into how elections really work and can predict the outcomes. And it's really simple. You don't have to take your shoes off to use the keys. You just have to be able to count to 5. That is, if the party holding the White House loses more than 5 keys, loses 6 or more keys, they're out. 6 strikes and you're out.
Okay,
and
so let's stop there.
The keys are phrased true-false questions. So 6 falses and the party in power loses. Fewer than 6, the party in power wins. And we have since used this system to predict the popular vote outcome. It's a national system of every American presidential election since 1984. That's 7 elections in a row. No other system has that record of advance predictions.
Right, so let's stop there because I have questions about that. So there's this system that's been going around that's being discussed from the University of Colorado, which claims to have a great track record. But a lot of that great track record was retroactively, right? In other words, their model applied retroactively with the knowledge of what took place would have worked. But when I looked at that system, your system has a far longer track record of actually in advance prediction. Correct me if I'm wrong.
You're 100% right. Most people don't make that distinction, but it's absolutely critical. It's not that hard, although it's hard to predict elections where you already know the outcome. It's an awful lot harder to predict elections when you don't know the outcomes. By the standards of their model, you can say my model has been correct since 1860 for over 150 years, retrospectively. effectively.
So the big question,
actual advanced prediction, it's only been, I wouldn't say only, it's been correct since 1984. I hate to say it, but the way these guys talk about their model, they're frauds. They're charlatans. They're no better than sellers of snake oil. They haven't predicted those elections. And yet, I read their press release. I looked at their website. They say this model has predicted the results of elections since 1980. That's not prediction. And as academics, they should know better. And it's a real shame that, my colleagues are perpetrating this kind of misleading information. Maybe
okay,
they
so
didn't.
The big question, though, Professor.
But they have.
The big question is, applying your system to the upcoming election that's 55 or so days away, who's going to win?
I first predicted the outcome of the 2012 election in January of 2010. When I found that President Obama, the candidate of the party holding the White House, had only 4 negative keys. You need 6 to count them out. So I predicted 2.5 years ago that Obama was going to be reelected, and I have stood by that prediction ever since. In fact, he's gained 1 more key by taking out Osama bin Laden, so he now only has 3 negative keys. It takes 6 negative keys to count him out.
Okay, so my question then becomes, do polls matter? Do the debates matter? Do campaigns matter? All of these things that have transpired and will transpire between your initial prediction, January 2010, and now, none of that is in the keys directly, but does any of that stuff make a difference?
None of that is in the keys directly, and none of that really matters at all. As I said, almost all of my predictions have been made before the campaigns even began. I predicted George W. Bush's reelection in April 2003. That said, obviously, it's not impossible that things happen during a campaign that can matter. It's conceivable a candidate can emerge as, a Ronald Reagan or a Franklin Roosevelt during the campaign, although that's never happened. A horrific foreign policy disaster could occur. The economy could go down the drain. But those kinds of things don't happen. Everybody talks about, the October surprise. Name me one October surprise. They don't occur.
Okay, let me ask you about a couple of these specifically. So, for example, some of the keys seem a little bit subjective. Like, for example, affecting major change in national policy, right? Let's talk about that one, and let's talk about health care, Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. That's one that you give to Obama, as Obama has that key. But there's been this strong misinformation campaign around Obamacare such that there isn't really overwhelming support nationally for what it did. So by what standard do we judge whether it is a major achievement? In other words, is it based on some kind of public polling analysis? Is it based on if there is such a thing as an objective analysis? How do you measure that?
Well, it's a very good question. And I have been attacked for, more than 30 years for my system having elements of judgment in it. And my answer to that is several-fold. One, the world is not objective, particularly when you're dealing with human beings. Historians have long known there has to be some degree of judgment. And I got blasted for decades by the professional forecasters. But about 8 years ago, they suddenly changed and they realized that their purely quote-unquote objective mathematical models didn't work. And all of a sudden, my idea of judgmental forecasting became the hottest thing in forecasting. I twice keynoted the International Forecasting Summit. Secondly, they look a lot more subjective when you just see a line on a piece of paper. Here's the key. But when you buy my book, The Keys to the White House, 2012 edition, you will see, number one, every key is very carefully defined. And number two, I've answered these questions 38 times before. And the next answer has to be consistent. And the definition clearly says it's not whether it is popular or not popular measured by the polls, because polls change all the time. 6 months ago, it looked like Obama's health care was much more unpopular than it is today. And in fact, today he's using it in a positive sense. All that key measures is have you in a significant way changed policy from the previous administration. And clearly, healthcare is not only a change from the previous administration historically, it's something that presidents have been seeking and failing to do since Harry Truman in the 1940s. So by all the standards of the keys and by standards of previous comparison, that was not a difficult call, quite frankly.
All right, so
more difficult calls than that.
Will you even watch on Election Day? I mean, since you already know what's going to happen, do you even care? Are you that certain that this is just in the bag for Obama?
Well, look, I'm a human being, right? And human beings are never perfect. Am I absolutely convinced, that I'll always be perfect? Of course not. All humans are fallible. Am I absolutely convinced that this is the best system available? Yes. Do I firmly believe it will hold this time? Yes. Will I rush and jump off my roof if it doesn't? No. 7 out of 8 wouldn't be terrible.
All right. Distinguished Professor of History at American University, Professor Allan Lichtman. Really great to talk to you. I encourage people to get the book and also check out the keys and decide for themselves if they agree with you on all 13.
David, that's really important. It's the world's only do-it-yourself prediction system. Anyone can answer these questions.
All right. Thanks so much. Let's take a break. We'll be back.